convinced that Shakespeare was the sole author of Timon? Some of the scholars suggest that he had some help, a co-author.
Reading it through carefully as I did, obviously, to write this paper, nothing really leapt out at me. I didn't see, one hand stop here and another begin there. It's interesting that we have no record of performance of the play in Shakespeare's time, and I get the feeling that he may have just set it aside as being rather too sort of raw and revealing. But yeah, I don't see more than one hand in it.
The suggestion was that some parts of it were well written and other parts poorly written, and therefore that implies different co-author implies.
Well, I don't know. I think some of the finest writing in it is when he's most furious, actually, and he's just this stream of imprecation comes out. And some of the weaker language is in the sort of earlier scenes where he's just setting the scene, as it were. And I said in the paper that I think that the early version was a history of the solitary knight in 1576-7 when he returned from Italy, and then that he definitely took this up again. It was probably left as a sketch, or performed at court as a device then, very short, maybe 40 minutes, and then taken up later, towards the end of his life. That's how I see it.
One way of thinking of the plays you describe it is that he's been traumatized in early childhood, and the queen becomes a mother substitute. In order to deal with his helplessness, shame, and rage, instead of continuing to be the helpless victim of the mother figure, he destroys himself. The rage turned against himself, where he is not her victim, but his own. We see this in trauma again and again, trying to undo the past without being conscious of it. But the way you describe your understanding of it, I think you do understand that's what he's doing. That he is injuring himself to free himself of having been injured by Elizabeth now in adulthood, and the loss of the mother figure.
Yes. Yes. No, I think there is definitely an element of that. Yeah, and there is a sense of, as I say, I think whether you take him literally as Elizabeth's son, or whether she is an adopted mother figure, and of course, as a ward of court, she would have been in loco parentis in many ways. Either way that you see it, there is an inability to separate himself from that matrix. But I've seen that in the study of other people in the arts as well, and it keeps them connected to something very powerful, but emotionally can make them extremely unsatisfactory individuals, at least to those around them.
A source of creativity, on the one hand, that consumes them on the other.
Yes, exactly.
You mentioned Eliot and the correlative, and recently I've been reading him on Hamlet, and he makes the same mistake there. And I kept wanting to email him a copy of Saxo Grammaticus, because in that there was a model that Oxford had. You may know how the chiming of his ability to, he could read it in the Latin and whenever he came to it. The point is that in this case he ends up with the Princess of Britain and the Queen of Scotland, both. And so there isn't any woman that's over him, but there's still a Polonius who gets eaten up by the hogs, and a whole bunch of other people in it. As a model, now, for the first time, I realized it in Timon, you have no, Hamlet ends, bang, he's dead.
Yeah.
But the other ending is going on. And in Saxo, of course, he takes these two ladies back to Denmark and lives for many years as a wonderful king. So,
yes.
How can you get these mirrors all to focus on bringing the light at the right place?
I know. Well, it's quite a challenge. I think, obviously one of his big challenges in Timon was the fact that if you're going to isolate a character to the degree that he isolates Timon, then how do you get rid of him? And he doesn't commit suicide, or at least not overtly. But this play, the end of the play, might tell us something very important about 1604 and what he planned or what actually happened. I don't know. But yeah, it's a beguiling image at the end.
And the symbolism of rooting himself and finding gold in Mother Earth is this, finally, I've achieved what I've sought all my life.
Yes. Yes. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
I think you mentioned that in 1580 he fell out of favour with the Queen.
Yes.
Why did he fall out of favour?
Yes, well, right at the end of 1580, in December, he took the decision to accuse two former associates of his of treason. That was Henry Howard, Charles Arundel, and Francis Southwell, actually 3 people. He obviously felt that their activities were treasonous. They were Catholics. He had been friendly with them, as he was with a number of Catholics. And he may have realized that they were gearing up to make some sort of accusation against him. But either way that it happened, both sides, Oxford himself and his accusers, were arrested, put under house arrest. And in fact, at the beginning of Richard II, you see this, where there's that projected duel between the Duke of Norfolk, which is, of course, the Howard family, and Bolingbroke. And they're both trading accusations against each other. Out of these accusations came what are known as the Howard Arundel libels, which I think are very valuable documents in studying Oxford psychology, because although they may have exaggerated some of them, they're certainly not made up. And they're some of the most personal and revealing documents that we have about him. Anyway, they were released, and so was Oxford eventually. But the whole Vavasor scandal followed quick on the heels of that. And in the end, he was banished from court and was away for about 2.5 years.
You mentioned a connection to a biblical phrase, I guess it was Matthew 25 or something,
yes.
Word gift. Is that one of the underlying passages in the Geneva Bible by chance?
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I'll ask Roger Strickmatter. He will know. But yeah, that's a good point.
In connection with the attack on Elizabeth, to the effect that she was stricken with the great pox in her old age, and they had to put makeup on to cover it up. That's really cruel, considering that she was stricken by the smallpox as a young woman and had to start putting the makeup on that early. Yeah. I mean, she was considered ugly by inner members of the court, probably including Oxford, from the time she was a young woman, partly because of that affliction.
Right.
And, what?
Yes. Well, she did. You're right. She contracted smallpox in 1562, and her life was in danger for a while. And the lady that tended her, which I think, yes, was the Sidney lady, Lady Sidney, who was Robert Dudley's sister. She was very badly scarred. But Elizabeth got off pretty lightly as far as the scarring of the face went. But later on, yes, she did apply the makeup very thickly. And of course, there was a lot of mercury in makeup at that time. And mercury was also used in the treatment of syphilis. So I imagine she had a pretty strong dose of it, one way or the other. But it is interesting. I mean, D.H. Lawrence mentions this congenital syphilis. And a lot of people have speculated that was, that Edward VI, that was his problem too. And also Henry VIII suffered from it. And I don't know what that does to a man's psyche or his mentality. The madness in King Lear, in Timon and so on, is that syphilis induced? I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but it'd be interesting to know.
Symptoms are very different.
Yeah.
Charles, wonderful analysis of that play. I wonder, given the other thing that's going on right now with the other book, your book and the other book, I'll call it, if James Shapiro was here with us right in the front row, what would you say to him about imagination vis-a-vis what you have just said about this play? And you used the word imagination several times in your talk.
Yes. Well, I would say to him that I believe that he has confused imagination and fantasy, and that imagination doesn't come from nowhere. You know, it comes from your soul life. So there are real reasons why an author chooses certain themes, why his imagination latches onto them. And I would say it's very dangerous what he said in his book, that the more an author is able to remove himself from his works, the greater his imagination.
Yes.
He actually says it demeans a play like Hamlet. Think of it as autobiographical. Then you have to get rid of most of the great literature, you know, of the Western canon. You know, Joseph Conrad spent 16 years in the Merchant Navy, captained a steam packet down the Congo. You know, out of those experiences came the Heart of Darkness. Well, according to Shakespeare, he should have stayed home. And as I was saying a couple of days ago, that, you know, if I write a story about 12 pink elephants on the moon, that is fantasy. It's not imagination. We live in a culture saturated by fantasy, and people have lost that distinction. And I see it through the lens of painting. You know, an artist sets up his easel in front of a landscape or a figure. He paints what's in front of him, but he gives that symbolic depth. And that's what a writer does with his experiences. He gives them symbolic depth. He digs down to that mythic substratum of the soul. And so I think that imagination, true imagination, can only, you know, deepen a work of art. But as Bill pointed out, this term imagination has now become Shapiro's substitute for what Stratfordians all used to call genius. It's the same. Has exactly the same meaning. It's synonymous with genius. Imagination. Ooh, yes, just pluck it from there. Yeah. So it's a magical force, and it's beguiling to those who don't really think about these things.
Sex magic.
It just strikes me that the Stratfordian side has reached the approach of lawyers. You know what I mean? In that they have a side to espouse, and whatever means it takes to do that, that's suitable.
Yes.
That's an insult to attorneys, Richard.
Oh, I'm sorry. There are
yes.
lawyers and there are Shakespeare's.
I agree with that, because in a sense you have to feel sorry for them, because they inherited this mythology. They didn't create it. It was created by the politicians of the Elizabethan age. So they have to find a way to deal with it. Now, of course, the best way is just to come clean and say it's rubbish. But they're not going to do that. So as you say, it's like a brief. You know, a lawyer, you know, you might be asked to defend O.J. Simpson or someone else.
Exactly.
It's not a good brief, and you have to find a way of doing it. And Shapiro's book is very loyally, because he's like the counsel for the prosecution who spends his time undermining the witnesses for the defense, whether it's Loney, Freud, whatever. And he does it in a very clever, very subtle manner. And so, yes, he has played the part of a lawyer. They're wonderful people, of course.
Well, as a lawyer, a very principled lawyer, who I feel that many of the Oxfordians are lawyers. And we often listen to people and we listen to witnesses and we try to know, where is this person coming from? Where is the evidence that would support? How do we prove this motive? How do we prove by circumstantial evidence something that's more probably true than not? And that it also appeals to many, many lawyers, a search for truth and justice.
Yes.
Sorry.
Charles, thank you so much. I've been wanting to write a book on Timon, and now I don't feel like I need to. I think it's one of the most important plays in the canon to understand. One of the things that really made me feel so at home when I discovered Oxford was we don't have to think of all those late romances as his final play. I feel that Lear and Timon were probably the final prize from Oxford, and I wanted to ask you what you thought was his last. For me, his last line is those 5 words: never, 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 never.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. I've always felt that about King Lear. I mean, King Lear for me is the ultimate play, and it's always been my favorite, and the one that I think reflects Shakespeare's inner landscape with more faith than any other. And I've always thought of that. I mean, yes, he did go back to plays like Hamlet at the end too. But in terms of where he was in his development, his soul life, etc., that for me is the ultimate, is King Lear. And of course, those final two words of Edgar's is almost like an instruction to us. You know, the weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. You know. So I think yes, definitely, and I agree with you also about the romances. And as you brought to the fore again today, The Tempest is an extremely mysterious play. It's very odd, and of course Loney pointed that out first. You know, the first Oxfordian to point that out, and it's a challenge. It is a real challenge. But as you know, it is put right at the front of the first folio, so obviously there's a very important message there.
One can consider the possibility that the general reversal in King Lear, where Lear is the potent father who becomes impotent, and Cordelia represents the soul of the Earl of Oxford, the innocent, truly loving child who is abandoned, unappreciated, and finally is destroyed.
Yes. Yes, that's true. And I don't think, you know, that often happens in the plays, is a sort of switch of gender like that. And Edgar, of course, shadows, he's very much a figure like Cordelia. And it makes sense that someone who had been denied his kingdom, whether you think it was literally the kingdom of England, the crown, or the kingdom of his works, his artistic kingdom.
The kingdom of the heart.
Of the heart, exactly. It makes sense that he would always fantasize about this restoration or redemption, which he does in so many of the plays, you know, Winter's Tale as well, and so on. And I think that's often one of the most moving moments. And again, where Prospero steps forward at the end to show himself as he truly is. He must have fantasized about that moment so many times in his life.
I thought of something else with respect to this question of the strumpetry of Queen Elizabeth. At the end of Cleopatra,
Yeah.
when Cleopatra is dying, or is about to die, and she gives this little soliloquy in which she says, "I don't want to be remembered like some she makes a reference to the
boy actors.
the boy actors who are like little prostitutes, I think she says. I don't want to be...
Yes, yeah, that's right. She doesn't want to be dragged through the streets of Rome, you know, like one of these squeaking actors.
Right. And she seems to be disavowing, you know, that she's saying, I don't want to be remembered that way. And he's Oxford is sympathetic with her at that moment in time. He's also making a reference to the thing that we often forget, that all of these female characters were played by little boys.
Yeah.
And so you have the double irony of a little boy saying, "I'm about to die. Please don't remember me as a little prostitute." Now that seems to me it seems to me to, in a sense, a work against your sexual theme in Fortuna, and I wonder. Now I agree that Oxford had a long-standing resentment against Elizabeth, and I agree that it's symbolized over and over and over again in his plays. I don't know whether the average playgoer in 1600, 1603, something like that, would understand everything that you said today. But if they saw that other symbol that is in not only in Timon or Timon, but in many other plays as well, Elizabeth as the moon, the failing, weak, detestable moon, whose light is a pale reflection of the sun. She's not very smart.
You're right.
I mean, his resentment against her, I think, is in part the fact that she's not an intellectual like he is.
I'm not sure about that. She was a very bright woman. Yeah.
I didn't say for a moment that she was a very bright, well-educated woman.
But she was
She wrote well,
Yeah.
but she was not an intellectual.
Them fighting words for some reason.
Could I ask a question about your last slide? That's the cover of your book, and I guess I have missed what the middle image significance is.
Yes, the middle image it comes from a portrait most commonly known as the Persian portrait of Queen Elizabeth. It's actually part of the royal collection, and I saw it about 3 years ago at Hampton Court, and they had renamed it Shakespeare's Dark Lady, which was pretty amazing. And it shows a pregnant Elizabeth crowning a weeping stag. And it goes back to the whole myth of Actaeon, which, the hunter in ancient Greek mythology who comes upon Diana, the virgin goddess, bathing naked in a woodland pool. And because he's seen what he should not have seen, across that line, the goddess turns him into a stag. He's pursued by his own hounds and torn to pieces. And in a sense, that's the story of Shakespeare and Elizabeth. He saw what he should not have seen. He crossed that taboo. And here she is. It's a very moving picture. It's like the reconciliation of Diana and Actaeon. The stag is weeping, its art made tongue-tied by authority, and she is crowning it with a crown of pansies. So for me, that's always been, again, a symbol of the way that he always mythologized, in one way, the relationship that he had with Elizabeth. He tried to raise it up. He does that in Antony and Cleopatra. He does that in The Phoenix and the Turtle, in a very stark manner, I believe.
Well, no, I mean, I just have to say again, she was a very, very bright person. She was not any kind of fool. She may have big problems in her life, big, big problems.
Was she an intellectual?
A very smart person.
Yes.
She was.
Absolutely.
We learned her history.
Look at the lady when she was 14, she wrote a poem. She was 14, translated a poem.